Sarah Mitchell always knew she was different. The way her skin seemed to shimmer ever so slightly in moonlight. How her dreams were filled with constellations she'd never seen in Earth's night sky. And the strange ability she had to sense others' emotions. These were just some of the peculiarities she'd learned to hide from the world. Her mother, Eleanor, had taken most of the secrets to her grave 15 years ago, leaving Sarah with nothing but fragments of truth and a letter to be opened on her 30th birthday. That letter changed everything. My dearest Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll have been gone for quite some time, and you deserve to know the truth about your father, about who you really are. The man you grew up calling Dad wasn't your biological father. On a warm summer night in 1988, I met someone extraordinary. He called himself Aries, and he came from a place far beyond our stars. Sarah had read those words 5 years ago, sitting alone in her apartment on her 30th birthday, her hands trembling as 30 years of questions finally found their answers. Her father was a Lyrian, a species of interstellar travelers who had been secretly visiting Earth for millennia. They looked human but possessed abilities that humans would consider supernatural. Empathy, cellular regeneration, and in rare cases, the power to manipulate energy fields. Now, at 35, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, examining the familiar stranger that gazed back at her. Her copper-red hair caught the light in ways that seemed almost alive, and her violet eyes, a trait she'd always attributed to a genetic quirk, now served as a reminder of her otherworldly heritage. She was living 2 lives, one as a successful architectural designer in Boston, and another as a half-alien woman struggling to understand her growing powers. But lately, a new complication had entered her carefully balanced world. His name was James Chun, her stepson through her marriage to David 3 years ago. At 25, James was only 10 years her junior, a brilliant quantum physicist who had recently moved back to Boston for a research position at MIT. The problem wasn't just that he was her stepson. It was the way her Lyrian empathic abilities seemed to intensify whenever he was near, creating a connection that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. It had started 3 months ago, when James began visiting their home more frequently. At first, Sarah attributed the strange sensations to her powers growing stronger, as they had been doing since she turned 30. But soon she realized it was something specific to James. When he was in the room, she could feel not just his emotions, but glimpses of his thoughts, fragments of memories, and most disturbingly, an echo of the same connection coming from him. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table while David was away on business, Sarah caught James staring at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. In that moment, she felt it, a spark of recognition in him, as if some part of his consciousness could sense what she was. The wine glass in her hand had shattered, her powers momentarily slipping out of control. "Are you all right?" James had asked, rushing to help clean up the mess. When their hands touched, reaching for the same piece of broken glass, a surge of energy passed between them that left them both frozen in place, staring at each other with a mixture of confusion and something else, something neither of them dared to name. That night, Sarah lay awake, her mind racing. The Lyrian part of her was drawn to James in a way she couldn't explain, as if their very atoms recognized each other. Her human side was horrified by these feelings for her stepson, and her conscience was torn apart by guilt over her growing emotional distance from David. But the most terrifying question kept her awake until dawn. What if James wasn't just sensing her Lyrian nature? What if he had inherited something from his own unknown father? The timing would match with another Lyrian visit to Earth, and it would explain the impossible connection between them. Sarah knew she had to tell him the truth about herself, about what she suspected about him. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that this revelation would either save them both or destroy everything she had built in her human life. What she didn't know was that James had already begun his own investigation into his mysterious heritage, and their paths were about to collide in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, love, and what it means to be human. James Chun had always felt like an outsider in his own skin. Growing up, he'd attributed his differences to being adopted, but lately, he'd begun to suspect there was something more to his story. His recent breakthrough in quantum entanglement research wasn't just theoretical. He could somehow feel the connections between particles, as if they were extensions of his own consciousness. The day Sarah's wine glass shattered changed everything. That brief touch of their hands had awakened something in him, like a dormant gene suddenly expressing itself. In the weeks that followed, James found himself experiencing strange phenomena. Objects moving slightly when he was deep in thought, dreams filled with mathematical equations that solved themselves, and most disturbingly, an ability to sense Sarah's presence even before she entered a room. One rainy Tuesday evening, while working late in his MIT lab, James made a discovery that would shatter his understanding of reality. He'd been running tests on his own DNA, curious about the strange anomalies he'd noticed in his cellular structure, when his computer began displaying impossible results. His genetic code contained sequences that didn't match any known human patterns, sequences that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves as he watched. Driving home that night, his mind racing with implications, James nearly crashed his car when a sudden vision overwhelmed him. He saw a man with violet eyes like Sarah's, standing in what appeared to be a ship made of crystalline structures, looking down at Earth with an expression of longing. The vision felt like a memory, but not his own, more like an echo passed down through his very cells. When he arrived home, he found Sarah sitting alone in the darkened living room, as if waiting for him. The air between them crackled with an invisible energy that had become impossible to ignore. David was away again, as he often was these days, leaving them in a dangerous solitude that both craved and feared. "We need to talk," they said simultaneously, then shared a nervous laugh that did nothing to ease the tension. Sarah spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what you've been experiencing, James. The changes, the abilities, the visions." "How?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Because I'm like you," she replied, and as she spoke, her skin began to emit a subtle luminescence that he'd glimpsed before but had convinced himself was his imagination. "I'm half Lyrian, a species from a star system you'd know as Kepler 186. And I think you might be too." James sank into the chair across from her, his own skin beginning to respond with a similar glow. "The man in my vision, the one with violet eyes, could have been my father or—" Sarah hesitated. "Yours." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. If they shared this heritage, it would explain the impossible connection they'd been fighting, a connection that went far beyond their complicated family situation. "Show me," James whispered, extending his hand across the space between them. "Show me everything you know." Sarah hesitated only a moment before reaching out. When their fingers touched, the room disappeared in a flood of shared memories and sensations. James saw Sarah's mother meeting her father, felt the confusion of Sarah's childhood, experienced her discovery of the truth through the letter. In turn, Sarah witnessed James's struggles with his adopted parents, his inexplicable abilities, and the loneliness of feeling different without knowing why. But something else transferred between them in that touch, something neither had intended to share. Every suppressed feeling, every stolen glance, every moment of guilty attraction laid bare between them. They pulled apart gasping, the intensity of the connection leaving them both shaken. "This is wrong," Sarah said, standing abruptly. "You're my stepson, and I'm married to your father." "David's not my real father," James replied, also rising. "And what's happening between us? It's beyond human conventions. You can feel it too. We're being drawn together for a reason." "That doesn't make it right," Sarah whispered. But she didn't back away when James took a step closer. "Nothing about us is right by human standards," he said. "We're not fully human. The rules are different for us." Before either could say more, the sound of a car door slamming outside broke the moment. David was home early. They sprang apart, their skin's glow fading quickly, but both knew nothing would ever be the same. The truth was out, but it had only created more questions whose answers would force them to choose between their human lives and their alien heritage, between family loyalty and a connection that defied explanation. As David's key turned in the lock, Sarah and James shared one last look, acknowledging the unspoken truth. This was only the beginning of their story, and the hardest choices still lay ahead. The weeks following their shared revelation became an exquisite torture for Sarah and James. Every family dinner turned into an elaborate dance of avoided glances and careful distances, while their Lyrian connection grew stronger by the day. They could sense each other's presence throughout the house, their powers resonating like twin tuning forks struck in perfect harmony. David noticed the change in his wife and son, though he misinterpreted the tension. "You two seem different lately," he remarked one evening over dinner. "Is everything all right?" "Just stressed about work," Sarah replied too quickly, while James became intensely interested in his pasta. But David wasn't entirely convinced. A successful corporate lawyer, he'd built his career on reading people, and something about their behavior nagged at him. He began paying closer attention, coming home early from work without warning, watching their interactions with growing suspicion. Meanwhile, Sarah and James discovered their powers were evolving rapidly in each other's presence. One afternoon, while David was supposedly at work, they met in James's lab at MIT to experiment with their abilities. Sarah had called in sick to her architectural firm, knowing they needed to understand what was happening to them. "It's like quantum entanglement," James explained, surrounded by humming equipment. "Our Lyrian DNA is somehow linking us at a subatomic level. Watch this." He concentrated on a pencil on his desk, and it began to float. When Sarah joined her energy with his, the pencil started spinning, emitting a soft blue glow. "We're stronger together," Sarah whispered, both thrilled and terrified by the implications. Their experimental session was interrupted by an urgent text from David. "Coming to see your lab, James. Want to take you both to lunch. Be there in 15. They scrambled to hide evidence of their experiments, but the energy in the room remained charged, their powers still intermingling in visible ways. When David walked in, he found them standing suspiciously far apart, both looking flushed. "Everything okay?" he asked, eyes narrowing as he noticed a pencil rolling across James's desk without anyone touching it. "Dad, you're early," James said, quickly grabbing the pencil. "We were just. Sarah was helping me with some design visualization for my quantum computing setup," he finished lamely. David looked between them, his lawyer's instincts firing. "Right. Shall we get lunch?" That lunch became a turning point. Sitting in the upscale restaurant, David watched as his wife and son seemed to respond to each other's unspoken thoughts, moving in sync, anticipating each other's needs. When Sarah reached for the salt, James handed it to her before she asked. When James started to mention his research, Sarah changed the subject, as if sensing his near-slip into dangerous territory. But it was what happened during dessert that truly shook David's world. When their creme brulee arrived, Sarah and James both reached for their spoons at exactly the same moment. As their hands briefly touched, every light in the restaurant flickered, and their water glasses vibrated with a high-pitched ring. David saw something impossible. For just a split second, both Sarah and James seemed to glow with an internal light. He dropped his own spoon with a clatter. "What the hell was that?" "Power surge," James said quickly. "Old wiring," Sarah added simultaneously. David stood up abruptly. "I need some air." He walked out of the restaurant, leaving Sarah and James exchanging worried glances. "He's suspicious," Sarah said, their connection allowing her to sense David's emotional turmoil. "We need to tell him something," James replied, "but not the whole truth. He's not ready." What they didn't know was that David had already begun his own investigation. That evening, after making an excuse about working late, he sat in his office and opened his laptop. He started researching quantum physics experiments at MIT, unexplained phenomena, and his wife's mysterious past. His search history revealed his growing obsession: genetic anomalies, spontaneous energy phenomena, alien hybridization theories. Meanwhile, Sarah and James faced another crisis. Their powers were becoming harder to control, especially when they were apart. Objects would move on their own when they thought of each other. Electronics malfunctioned around them, and most alarming, they had begun sharing dreams, vivid visions of crystalline cities on distant worlds, and of other Lyrians watching them with great interest. One such dream shook them both awake at exactly 3:33 a.m. Sarah sat up in bed beside a sleeping David, while across town, James jolted awake in his apartment. They had seen something devastating. A vision of government agents discovering their secret, of laboratories and experiments, of their powers being weaponized. But most troubling was the figure that appeared at the end of the dream. A tall man with violet eyes who looked remarkably like both of them. "We need to meet," James texted Sarah. Tomorrow, noon. The Arboretum, she replied. Neither of them noticed David, who wasn't actually asleep, watching Sarah's phone screen reflect on the bedroom ceiling, the glow illuminating his face as he added another piece to his growing puzzle. The truth was unraveling faster than they could control it, and tomorrow's meeting would force them to make decisions that would change not just their lives, but possibly the future of two. The Arnold Arboretum was unusually empty that autumn afternoon, as if nature itself was conspiring to give Sarah and James privacy. Golden leaves spiraled down around them as they walked deeper into the sanctuary, their footsteps crunching on the leaf-strewn path. Neither spoke until they reached a secluded bench beneath an ancient oak tree. I couldn't sleep after that dream, Sarah began, her hands trembling slightly. It felt different from the others, more like a warning. It was, James replied, his voice tight with tension. I've been doing calculations all morning. The quantum fluctuations around us are increasing exponentially. We're causing disturbances in the fabric of spacetime itself. Sarah's eyes widened. Is that why? She gestured to the space between them, where leaves were now floating, suspended in midair, caught in the energy field their proximity created. Yes, and it's getting stronger. Look. James pulled out his phone and showed her a series of graphs. These are readings from my lab equipment. The energy signature we're generating. It's acting like a beacon. A beacon for what? Not what who. I think we're signaling the Lyrians. Maybe even our fathers. The revelation hung in the air between them, as heavy as the autumn mist. Sarah stood and paced, her agitation causing small whirlwinds of leaves to dance around her feet. This is too dangerous, she said finally. David's already suspicious. And if we're actually sending out some kind of interstellar signal, we can't stop it, James interrupted, standing to face her. The connection between us, it's not just emotional or genetic. We're quantum entangled at a cellular level. The more we try to stay apart, the more energy we generate. As if to prove his point, when he took a step closer to her, the air around them began to shimmer with an aurora-like display. Sarah felt the familiar pull, the way her entire being seemed to resonate with his presence. Then what do we do? She whispered, fighting the urge to close the distance between them. Before James could answer, a new voice cut through their private world. You tell me the truth. All of it. They spun around to find David standing on the path, his face a mask of controlled anger and hurt. In his hand was a thick file of papers. I've been following you, he said, walking closer. And I've been doing my research. Care to explain these? He held up printouts of James's lab readings, satellite imagery showing energy anomalies centered on their house, and most damning of all, a photograph of Sarah's mother with a man whose violet eyes matched Sarah's perfectly. Where did you get that? Sarah gasped, reaching for the photo. Your mother's safety deposit box. I had it opened this morning legally as your husband. David's voice cracked on the last word. I also found this. He pulled out a small crystal that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The moment the crystal came into view, both Sarah and James felt a surge of power unlike anything they'd experienced before. The crystal began to glow brightly, responding to their combined energy. Around them, every leaf, twig, and stone began to float, creating a swirling vortex of debris. David, please, Sarah started. But she was interrupted by a blinding flash of light from above. They all looked up to see the clouds parting, revealing something massive and crystalline slowly descending from the sky. No, James breathed. It's too soon. We're not ready. But the ship, for that's undeniably what it was, continued its descent, its surface reflecting the autumn sunlight in rainbow patterns across the arboretum. Other visitors to the park stood frozen in shock, phones raised to capture the impossible sight. David stumbled backward, the crystal slipping from his fingers. As it fell, both Sarah and James instinctively reached for it, their hands touching as they caught it together. The resulting surge of energy knocked David off his feet and created a visible shockwave that rippled through the trees. The crystal in their joined hands began to speak not in words, but in images and emotions that flooded their minds. They saw the truth of their origins, the real reason for their connection, and the choice they would have to make. They weren't just random hybrid children of curious Lyrian visitors. They were part of a generations-long plan, their very existence engineered to create a bridge between two worlds. Their attraction, their powers, their quantum entanglement, all of it had been orchestrated. As the ship landed in a clearing nearby, casting its brilliant light over them, Sarah and James faced each other with new understanding. Behind them, David watched in stunned silence as his wife and son began to glow with an otherworldly light, their true heritage impossible to deny. But the choice they faced was far more complex than simply choosing between Earth and their alien heritage. The images from the crystal had shown them both the potential and the price of their union, a price that would affect not just their family, but the future of human-Lyrian relations. As figures emerged from the ship, their violet eyes gleaming with ancient knowledge, Sarah squeezed James's hand. Whatever they decided, they would face it together. The time for secrets, the beings that emerged from the crystalline ship moved with fluid grace, their forms simultaneously familiar and alien. Leading them was the man from Sarah and James's shared dreams, tall, with violet eyes that held centuries of wisdom. Behind him walked two others who bore striking resemblances to Sarah and James, and the truth hit them both at once. They were facing their fathers. Sarah, the first being, spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. James, we have waited a long time for this moment. David, still on the ground, found his voice. You're really aliens? We are Lyrians, Sarah's father, Ares, corrected gently. And we are here because our children have awakened something unprecedented. James's father stepped forward, his features so similar to his son's that it was startling. The connection between you was not an accident. For millennia we have watched humanity, knowing that eventual contact was inevitable. But direct integration of our species proved problematic. We're an experiment, Sarah realized, anger coloring her voice. You engineered us to be compatible. Not just compatible, Ares said. You are the first successful fusion of our species, beings capable of existing in both worlds, understanding both cultures. Your connection has proven that true harmony between humans and Lyrians is possible. Around them, the Arboretum had become a scene of controlled chaos. Police sirens wailed in the distance, and news helicopters circled overhead. The Lyrian ship had erected some kind of energy field that kept curious onlookers at a distance, but they could see phones recording everything. The world is watching, James said, gesturing to the gathering crowd. There's no going back from this. That was always the intention, his father replied. Your union was meant to force the inevitable open contact between our worlds. But the choice of how that contact proceeds rests with you. Sarah turned to David, who had risen to his feet, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. I never meant to hurt you, she said softly. What I feel for James, it goes beyond anything I can explain in human terms. I think I'm starting to understand that, David replied, his voice rough with emotion. He looked between them, seeing their joined hands still clutching the crystal, the identical glow that surrounded them. You never really belonged to this world, did you? Either of you. That's where you're wrong, James said firmly, turning to face the Lyrians. We belong to both worlds. And if that's true, then we don't have to choose between them. Sarah felt his intention through their connection and stepped forward with him. Together, they raised the crystal, which had begun to pulse in sync with their heartbeats. You engineered us to be bridges, Sarah declared. So let us be bridges. The crystal exploded with light, and suddenly every human watching could see what Sarah and James saw, the quantum web of connections binding all living things, the deeper truths that transcended species. For one breathtaking moment, humanity glimpsed the universe through Lyrian eyes. When the light faded, the world had changed forever. The Lyrians had not hidden their ship or erased memories. Instead, at Sarah and James's insistence, they had chosen truth. In the months that followed, the story of a forbidden love between a half-alien woman and her stepson became the story of humanity's first steps into a larger universe. Sarah and James became ambassadors between the worlds, their unique perspective helping to ease the transition as humanity grappled with the reality of alien life. David, after much soul-searching, became an advocate for human-Lyrian cooperation. his legal expertise proving invaluable in establishing the first interspecies accords. His love for Sarah transformed into something different but no less real, a deep friendship based on shared experiences and mutual respect. As for Sarah and James, their connection continued to grow, transcending the boundaries of conventional relationships. They established a new life together, splitting their time between Earth and Lyria, their union a living proof that love could bridge the gap between stars. 1 year after the day in the Arboretum, they stood together on a balcony overlooking a Lyrian city, its crystalline spires reflecting the light of an alien sunset. Sarah's hand rested on her swelling belly, where their child, the first of a new generation of bridge builders, grew. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked, his hand covering hers. "Going public? Changing everything?" Sarah turned to him, her violet eyes meeting his. "How can I regret choosing both worlds? We're not just their experiment anymore. We're proof that love can transcend species, planets, even the bonds of family. We're writing our own story now." Above them, Earth shone like a blue jewel in the alien sky, while around them, the crystalline city hummed with the same quantum energy that had drawn them together. They had transformed a tale of forbidden love into something greater, a story of transformation, not just for themselves, but for two worlds. In the end, it wasn't their Lyrian heritage that made their love extraordinary. It was their human hearts, capable of reaching across the stars to find each other, that had changed the course of two civilizations. Their love had become a bridge between worlds, proof that the heart's truth transcends all boundaries, even those written in the stars.